It's my pleasure tonight I have a decree, rather long, to introduce Gensler. Now I'm going to try something here which is, I believe, on the desktop. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to prove something tonight, and it is, oops, oh man, there we go. 10 reasons you didn't know SCI-Arc and Gensler are very similar. And then I'm going to introduce our speakers, of course, and do the usual formal thing. So the first thing is that Gensler really needs no introduction. If you're in this room, you probably know why you're here. If you haven't been paying attention, they are the 800-pound gorilla in the room, period. Perhaps Goliath, to most architects, David. But Gensler, like SCI-Arc, actually is also something else. It's a startup that made it big against all odds. We have a lot in common. So without further ado, here are my top 10, and this is meant to be lighthearted, so nobody get offended, Rob.
It would take a lot more than this.
Number 10, they're both highly ranked. So Gensler was ranked number 2 in 2011 and number 1 in 2012 on Architectural Record's top 250 architecture firms list. SCI-Arc was recently published as 2013 Best Architecture and Design School, number 1 in graduate and undergraduate. In the Western US. They are both middle-aged. Gensler's almost 50 years old. Founded in 1965 in San Francisco by Arthur Gensler. Midlife crisis averted. SCI-Arc was founded in 1972, which means we're going to be 40 years old next spring. Midlife crisis ahead. Now, locally, they both started in Santa Monica. SCI-Arc started in a warehouse over on Berkeley Street. Some of the founding faculty are here, Bill Simonian, 1972, I guess. And about 8 or 10 years later, Gensler started its first office also in Santa Monica, I believe. They both moved downtown. SCI-Arc came downtown to start the next chapter in our evolution in 2001. We moved about 40 staff, about 80 faculty, and 400 students to this very building. People told us it could not be done, but we had to grow. And we did it, and we transformed. Last year, Gensler also moved downtown, but they moved 250 employees to this new jewel box at City National Plaza, where I'm expecting to be invited for lunch. Shortly, if I don't F this up. Gensler went in, quote, in large part because of the firm's commitment to finding a transformative space to house its growing practice. So they did it, and they're transforming. So just a note here, Santa Monica, downtown, we did it first, and you guys are following us. Stop. Okay. They're both rebuilding downtown. So among recent projects for Gensler LA are the 55-story Ritz-Carlton Hotel and Residences and JW Marriott at LA Live, the renovation of the AT&T Center Tower, and most recently, and I think incredibly, AEG selected Gensler to design its new Farmers Field project, which I believe is a $1 billion football stadium and event center in South Park, or next to South Park. Now, we're also building a football stadium with robots. It's not true. However, we do have robots, and we have 6 of them, so I encourage you guys to go check them out. We're both global and big. Gensler has 42 offices worldwide and employs 2,500 people. We have alumni on every continent and in every country, 4,000 of them, even one in Antarctica. Also not true. They both work at all scales. So believe it or not, Gensler completes close to 4,000 projects a year, ranging in size from wine labels to new urban districts. We complete 4,000 projects a week, ranging in size from nanorobots to entire new galaxies. So we win. No, I'm kidding. Okay, they both pursue excellence and innovation, and I think this is very important. SCI-Arc faculty and leadership have garnered more than 500 national and international design awards and recognitions. Gensler has won too many awards for us to list here, but here are 2. AIA Architecture Firm Award 2000, U.S. Green Building Council Leadership Award for Organizational Excellence in 2005, and another one, multiple winner of the Business Week Architectural Record Awards, the U.S. Benchmark for Business Design Innovation. Now, the really surprising one is that Gensler and SCI-Arc both have architects. So we're all in a room together here. But I think most importantly, and I think this is where I'm going to lead into why it is great to have Gensler here tonight, They both support people, and sometimes the same people. I think there's several Gensler alumni here tonight who went to SCI-Arc, or SCI-Arc alumni who are at Gensler. Can you put your hands up? Oh yeah, there's 3 or 4 of you. But I'm pretty sure that firm-wide, there are a lot of SCI-Arc people. In fact, I know that as a fact. But I'm actually the opposite, which is in fact a Gensler alumni who is at SCI-Arc. So I will tell you that Rob Jernigan hired me, mistakenly, in I think 2000. And I worked there for 2 years, and in fact I learned a lot at Gensler, enough to have the confidence to start my own practice, to survive in a world that's often not driven by ideas, but deadlines and bottom lines. It is not an easy thing to be an architect with ideas these days, but at Gensler, I learned a lot about the sort of design and management tools that actually make my daily life better and make it possible for me to actually implement and realize my ideas. So in a way, before I introduce Rob, I have to thank Gensler and Rob actually for getting me started on my journey to having a practice. Now a little bit about Rob Jernigan. Rob has devoted more than 30 years to design leadership. He's known by his peers and clients alike as an exceptional architect, a great collaborator, and a great builder. He's an unmatched expert in translating elaborate designs into steel and concrete. And at the core of his success is his unshakable commitment to design innovation, technical quality, and the belief that each of us are only as good as the people we mentor and collaborate with to succeed as in practice. Jernigan began his career at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, I believe in Houston. That's correct, in the 1980s, and led his own practice before joining Gensler Los Angeles in 1998, with the charge of growing the firm's Los Angeles architectural studio, which I believe he's done. Since that time, he's built one of the most diverse and thriving architectural practices in Los Angeles and has nurtured a thriving network of design professionals throughout Southern California. Gensler's LA office is now the fastest growing among the firm's 43 locations worldwide, with a broad portfolio of noteworthy projects that range in scale and complexity. So Rob, welcome to SCI-Arc. Now Rob is also, I don't know, do you want to introduce your colleagues, or perhaps I should say that we're going to be joined on stage tonight by Eric Stultz, who is SCI-Arc, the ARC 92, welcome, who will address the global aspect of the business, Lee Wen, who will talk about doing business locally, and Shawn Gehle, I hope I pronounced that correctly, or Gehle, who will discuss the importance of research. So with that, I'd like you guys to welcome SCI-Arc's new friend, Gensler. Thank you for coming. I hope we're going to learn a lot tonight.
So again, thank you, Peter. And what you don't know is I have the top 10 reasons of why I hired Peter and then told him he should go out on his own. No, you know, it's great. This is a great community. And what is nice is that so many of us have worked together and I think meant so much to each other. And this is, as Peter and I were talking earlier, this is a very tough profession. There's some good times and there's some not so good times. And it's really important as we take this journey together, that we take it together as friends, we take it together with respect, and we really help each other out. And I think one of the toughest things about our profession is that unfortunately, a lot of the ways that we actually go in pursuit of work is competing with each other. And I think we all understand why we do that and the importance of it. But I think it's so critical that we compete with the highest level of dignity and respect for each other. Because if we don't respect each other and respect our profession, who will? And so again, having people like Peter, who worked with us before and say great things means a lot. So again, thank you so much, Peter. So it was very interesting when Eric called, and I appreciate that, and said, you know, Rob, we'd love you to come and talk about the explorations of the global practice of Gensler. And I said, how long do we have, a day or two? And he said, no, you've got an hour, so we'll get going and we'll be quick. But I think really in order to talk about the future and where Gensler's going, it's really important to talk about the past and where we've been. And when you think about Gensler, one of the things that we take a lot of pride in is Gensler's all about our people and who we are. And it's truly about, instead of a me, but a we culture. And how do we make sure that we get the best? And how do we, with the best, have the best expertise and provide the best services? So for that reason, I think it was very Gensler-like to have 4 of us make this presentation. And I'm going to go through the history and organizational strategy. Then Eric Stultz is going to do digital design, Lee Nguyen, design culture, and Shawn with applied research. Because honestly, they can do this better than I can, and I promise you that. So again, I think what's so interesting is Art Gensler, and if you've not met him, he's truly a remarkable man. And he really believes in environments, but equally important in environments is building relationships and understanding people. And that is the foundation of the firm, which I think is so important. Art grew up in New York, went to Cornell, moved to San Francisco, and shortly after he moved to San Francisco, he, like so many architects, he hung a shingle. And you can see the door where Art started his office in 1965. And it was very interesting. He, like most architects who started their business, was chasing anything he could get and doing as well as he could. Well, lo and behold, the Alcoa building was designed and being built, and actually Skidmore designed the building. And frankly, they were very busy at the time, and Alcoa said, well, they don't seem to be too interested about doing the interiors. And so this was sort of, a new thing to have a building and someone do the interiors. And of course, Art is like, what do you mean do interiors? I'm an expert. You need an expert to do the interiors. And Art actually went as a very small firm and won the interiors for the Alcoa building, this very large project. And that really sort of kicked off not only Gensler, but this real notion of the interiors profession. Shortly after this, Pennzoil came up, Hugh Lipke, and ultimately they had hired Hines Development, Philip Johnson, to design a building in Houston. And again, this was another building because what was going on at the time, there were tax law changes where a lot of corporations determined it was actually it was a greater tax advantage to actually become a tenant and move in these buildings versus create their own headquarters. And so again, Gensler interviewed and won the Pennzoil interiors for this building that Philip Johnson had done. So this really started a big trend for Gensler and frankly for the industry of doing interiors. And frankly, we were one of the first firms that really had a specialty of interior architecture. And so I think the other thing that was really interesting and critical at this time was when we agreed to do Pennzoil, Art looked over at Hugh and said, I will actually move Margot Grant and Tony to Houston to work on this project. And that was fairly unique to be a firm of probably about 45 people, take 2 of your senior people and move them to Houston to work with this client, but not just as a project office, but to literally establish an office in Houston that after the Pennzoil project would be done, that Tony Harbour and Margot would stay. And they did that. Then a couple of years later, well actually 5 or 6 years later, Margot moved to New York. Jim Follett, the other senior principal at Gensler, moved to Denver. And then Ed Friedrichs, and some of you may know, actually moved down to Los Angeles to start that office. So within a 10-year period of starting the firm, Gensler had already opened up, Art had 5 other offices. And these offices weren't just project offices, but these were offices that he created because of his belief in his people and his belief in opportunity and saying to his best people, I want to take care of you. I want to set you up in a situation to where you can succeed and do great things. And that's really been the foundation of the company. How do we ultimately provide opportunity for our people, get the best people, and service our clients? And so with that foundation, Gensler continued to grow to what it is today. And again, that is some 3,500 people, and it's about that opportunity. So again, I was going to talk a little bit about organizational strategy, and if you can't see this chart, it's a very good thing. We have charts. Frankly, our charts have charts. We've got so many charts. And for a company this big, it really is important to understand and how to manage and run this. We've also have our 4 axes for our charts. And again, offices, practice areas, client relationships, and design and delivery. So again, I want you to realize that the organizational strategy of a company and how you move it of this size is critical. But I don't think that's what today's about. Today is much more about how do you create and sustain something like this and what is in the core of the company. And so from that perspective, it's about you. It's about the professionals. It's about the architects. How do we create an environment for you to excel, to succeed, to do great things? And if we get you the best people, we can create a studio. And we can create a studio of 10 to 30 people. And I think, as most people would say, that's a nice size mid-level firm. And how do you have this studio of 30 people? Then the issue gets down to, if you have a studio or an office of 10 to 30 and you go to 40, what do? Well, what we believe is you keep that office, but you make 2 studios. And why do you make 2 studios? You make 2 studios because that gives opportunity for those people who work there. Because you can say, I need now 2 or 3 design directors. I need more project managers. And I'm going to give you the freedom to run your studio, and this studio will be a little different from this studio. And it's that ability to empower people that I think is the strength of our company. And so next thing you know, 1 studio turns to 2 or turns to 3, and this becomes a bigger office of multiple studios. And then once you have a bigger office of multiple studios, and a lot of times those are in the larger cities throughout the United States, well, next thing you know, someone says, we should chase San Diego Airport. And we do. Now again, we'll start a project office in San Diego. Well, guess what happens? Several people go, hey, I can do an airport, I want to do an airport, or frankly, I want to live in San Diego. And we'll say, well, the office is a project office, but if you really want that office to remain, then if you go there and do 1, a great job on that airport, and 2, build relationships in that community and find other work, then we can sustain that studio, and that studio will become an office. And lo and behold, you end up in San Diego, or you end up in Phoenix, or you end up in Las Vegas, and you start to see that you have a region now. Now, what's critical is that you don't have all these masses floating around and colliding in space, so that we can get galactic, Peter, I promise you. But you take these different studios and you bring them back to a hub in the region. And the critical nature of that hub is that we can be very smart with the expertise that we have, and that we're making sure that we're sharing that in our abilities. So every one of these offices, no matter what size, they have access to the best expertise that this company can provide. So we can provide that higher level of service. So that's how we can have a sports practice in Los Angeles and yet get the other sports projects in the other cities, because we have the local office with the local relationships, but we also have that expertise, because that's a very expertise-based practice. And lo and behold, you take these different hubs, you put them on the United States, and next thing you know, you've got 6 major hubs in the United States with these different offices all connected. And then you put it on the globe, and you have 43 locations, 30 in the United States, and 13 international. And then you realize you have 3,500 people working in 86 countries. And I will promise you, I sat down with Arthur 2 weeks ago, and I said, in '65, when you hung that shingle on the door, did you have any aspirations? And he said, I never would have believed this. He goes, I can't believe this happened. Now, again, please understand, yes, we do strategic planning, but the strategic planning we do is not bigger is better, is not let's go get big, let's go acquire companies, let's go do this. What I've described for you is organic growth, and it's growth that exists through empowerment of our people to help our people be everything they can be. Because if we can give them the opportunity and greater opportunity that they can have anywhere, then they will stay and they will work and they will be great. And that's our ultimate goal. And that empowerment is what caused this massive growth, not some strategy of acquiring a bunch of different companies. So what you really have, which is kind of interesting, and as we try to explain Gensler constantly to people, we say it's really an architect's collaborative. And when you look at all the offices, we have around 160 different studios that are working together but working independently to produce the best work that they can produce and to have those strong regional connects. So when you look at a company like this, you say, who owns it? And it's all about the people. So who owns something this big? We do. And I think that's very important. Again, it's very easy to say it's about the people. It's very easy to say it's about studios. But is it really? Well, it is if every member of Gensler owns a portion of it and has a piece of it. So we think that's very important because they do. And actually Arthur's down to 5% of ownership. So this is our company, and that makes us all, I think, believe in it more. But it's also about local cultures, and it's about, with these studios, and again, as we talk about local cultures, it's very easy to talk about the international cultures, but we need to talk about the national cultures, right? I came from Texas. Trust me, that's a culture of its own. And so it is about how do we have a Gensler culture, but how do we have, with all these different offices, a local culture and a local connectivity and a local understanding of what's important, right? Because as you become larger and more global, we believe one of the worst things you can do is put a singular footprint on projects around the world, because our strength is our diversity of people, and that's what's so important to us. So truly global versus global carpetbagging. And what we mean by that, as we pursue work in China and Shanghai, it started through a relationship. We now have 150 people in Shanghai. 80% are Chinese nationals. We're doing the second largest, our tallest building in the world, but when we finish that building, we won't pack it up and we won't come home. We will stay. We are part of that community. And trust me, one of the toughest things was convincing the communist government that all the people got stock and ownership in a U.S. company. But we worked that out. So anyway, just very quickly, now let's go back down to the small. I think what's important, Los Angeles is the hub of the region, and you'll see Las Vegas, Denver, Phoenix, San Diego, Newport, 624 people, which makes it a little larger than SCI-Arc. You'll see the LA office, which is 381, a little smaller than SCI-Arc. But just imagine all of SCI-Arc, all the students in SCI-Arc in one office. Think how crazy that would be. And maybe 31 SCI-Arc graduated students are in Gensler, LA. There's more in Gensler nationally, but just in the Los Angeles office. And of course, LA, very near and dear to all of us, 13 design schools in this area. And LA is one of the world's major design centers. And I think that's why we're all here, and that's what's so important to us. again, as you talk about in Los Angeles, we have 20 studios. And just to say, I've got 20 studios and 20 studio leaders, how does that function? How does that work? What keeps you? We actually identify practice area expertise for these different studios. So they're experts in all these different studios that you see. And that allows us to work cohesively. And I think what's become really exciting and very important for us recently, we just won the Philadelphia Eagles Stadium. And in pursuing that, we're against two firms that were both sports firms. And they approached it from a very sports perspective. But we took another perspective. We were able to bring our hospitality group in, our entertainment group, and our brand group, and say, you have the bowl. It isn't about view angles. It isn't about this. What you don't have is you don't have a great experience. And because we have these other studios and these other expertise, we can bring something different, and we can make this a better stadium than these other firms. And obviously it worked. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Stultz. You're going to see some things transition as he comes up. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, I am Eric Stultz, and I am a design director in the Sports and Recreation Studio. And when I graduated SCI-Arc in 1992, the only computers that existed in the entire school were sitting in a small lab. There were about 20 of them. They were all Macs, and they didn't have any CAD running on them. But it's great to see that SCI-Arc has now emerged as a leader in how we use computers to pursue design work. I'll talk a little bit about some of the buildings and how our office grew from a position of being really focused on interiors to a practice that is as diverse as it is today. Architecturally, probably the first real significant piece of work that was done was this project in Playa Vista called Water's Edge, followed soon after by 2000 Avenue of the Stars. This project in particular gave us a certain amount of legitimacy within a series of clients that we had been pursuing for a long time. This building was the result of a design competition and now serves as the headquarters for most villains in movies these days, which is some measure of a sign of success. Since that time, we've leveraged off of that to win projects in San Jose for the new international airport there. Also in 2006 to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, that we talked about before as well. In 2008, we really started to get a lot of awards. Projects to the MGM Place in Beverly Hills, which doesn't look like anything else in Beverly Hills these days. And in 2008, we also did this project here for Tishman Speyer. This is, we call it Playa Vista Parcel 3, mostly because we didn't get around to giving it a good name. That's the... We did this project for Tishman Speyer. And this is an example. I hope this plays here. This project is a project that I was the design director for. And this is a quick run through of the digital images that we produced for this project. Now this project was designed through modeling and rendering and all of the things that were really cutting edge about 10 years ago when I took over as the digital design leader for the firm. There's about 2,000 images here, which is about 40% of what we produced for this project. But this is state of the art at the time, and it really represents the last of what we see as a design paradigm. Today, we're looking at things a little bit differently. So that project fell into a paradigm that has probably been around since the beginning of architecture, which is the designers are working with an input device and a medium to produce design data, whether that's 2D drawings or 3D physical models that are built by hand. And what's happening in this is, it's been transformed with the tools that we use, but it's still the exact same process. So designers are using input devices and mediums to produce design data. And so if a designer says that I want to have the wall here, he puts that wall in place in the computer, and the computer really is just a place to store all of that design idea. But what's happening now, and we recognize that we're at an inflection point in how we use computers to do design. We've introduced a different medium, and this medium allows us to leverage the computers to participate in the design process and not be just somebody standing on the side recording things that a designer does. So the designer today has the ability to work directly with the computer and get feedback on analysis of design buildings and all kinds of things in addition to just understanding how visually the building will look. And we started to use these processes in projects like Farmers Field. Now, Farmers Field is a project that has a lot of different aspects to it. I'm going to talk specifically about the roof design on this project. This client, AEG, wished for this project to be an open-air stadium that could be closed on very few events that would, so that they could do things like an NCAA Final Four or a convention. And we approached the project from that point of view. And we began it with as efficient a layout as a seating bowl as we possibly could. It's a very tight site, and we worked this piece to death to make sure that it was handling all the functional aspects of the project. But when it came time to do the roof, we looked at very few things. First of all was to create the largest opening in a roof in an NFL stadium in the US. And that gave us some geometry lines right from the very beginning. We knew that we needed structure along lines like this, and that generally in elevation, they want to be shaped in a curve just to be efficient on how we laid out the structure. The second piece of geometry came from the seating bowl itself. So the seating bowl's edges are generally curved, they're flat in profile. And working with those finally in 3D, connecting them so that we're getting shade and protection from the weather just for those people that are sitting on those sidelines. But these are just the most basic components of how we put this together. We also looked at taking that shape and bringing it down to the ground so that the image of this stadium, which is really going to be about the roof for anybody who's driving to the site, would then be brought down to the ground so that if you walked up to this building, you would recognize what you're seeing at ground level as being similar to what you saw as you approached the building and not completely foreign to it. As a result, this is the most basic layout of this roof shape that we pursued and designed. But the real essence of how this roof is going to look is really about its structure. And so building all of this here and then playing with the design and being able to get feedback is something you couldn't have done with the process that I showed you before in Playa Vista. You can't rebuild this model every time you decide to move a column or change the edge of it. And since so much of the aesthetics are that structure, we wanted to be able to replicate that every time we moved. So we built a script. This is a Grasshopper script. I'm sure you guys have all seen this. But this script builds that entire roof and takes into variable all of the things that we showed you before. And so Lorenzo Morasso in our office built this script and based upon certain pieces of geometry where supports were structure-wise, columns, all the infill, including all of the retractable portion of this roof. It allowed us to continue to play around with where the columns would be, what shape all of the perimeter would be, and all the other pieces of it, and still be able to continually look at what it's going to really be like. And we are, even though we have finished a significant phase of this project, we are still very early in the design of this project. But this is what it looks like today, and it's been in the papers quite a bit. But this is the final result. Gave the client exactly what they were looking for, which is a very light roof, something that felt like it was airy and felt like it might lift off the ground. But the interesting piece is that this Grasshopper script, which was built by Lorenzo, and he did a great job on this piece, represents the difficulty that we have in implementing digital tools on a large scale. Lorenzo worked on this project and he did the whole thing himself, and it's really hard to work in Grasshopper with multiple people. But we needed to be able to take those tools and leverage it and do things on a more team-oriented basis. So we've started doing things like this. This is a seating bowl definition, and this allows us to do any seating bowl or any stadium with different modules that build up from suite levels to ground level and scale to any size that we need to. It also includes pieces that will tell us exactly how many seats are in each one of these different configurations. But it needs to be used by lots of different people. Now we've got 5 or 6 people just in our own studio who know Grasshopper real well, but typically they can't read each other's work. And a lot of the students, I'm sure you're going to see the same thing, that it's hard to pick up somebody else's grasshopper work. So we worked really hard to make sure that this was a collaborative effort. So Lorenzo was joined by Ryan Whitaker and Steve Chung, and they not only laid out the grasshopper definition for this in a very clear and straightforward way, but they documented exactly how they did it so that other people who hadn't seen it could come in and understand how to jump in and use the same tool. This, for us, is the future of how we use tools like this. The last piece I want to show you is the Shanghai Tower. So as Rob mentioned before, this project is under construction in Shanghai. This will be the second tallest building in the world until the project that we just won last week starts construction. And that will then be the second tallest building in the world. This project was documented in Revit. So every single thing in the building is done in Revit, but it wasn't designed in Revit. We use Revit to do a lot of coordination, so every single floor, all the sub-consultants work in Revit. But we've got people that are working in lots of other tools as well because they're much better for that, all our consultants. So our structural consultant uses Tekla to define every single detail and be able to do shop drawings for the project so they can build it like this. So this is one small, relatively, piece of the project built in a shop, but it's also built. We have to take into account things like making sure that you can fit it on a truck and you can drive it down the street. And so we use simulation software to make sure that that can happen. We also use simulation software to make sure that we can understand the correct sequencing for putting these pieces together. So this is, all of these pieces you're seeing here, especially the gray ones, gray and the blue ones. In a super tall building like this, you don't do a steel building, you don't do a concrete building, you do a composite building where the steel in this is actually acting as the rebar for the project. So you see in some of these shots, you see little studs sticking out the sides of it. That's what will make this building go up. It's also interesting to note that the contractors that we work with also are utilizing the same sort of simulation software. So the winning contractor on the project got the project because he could demonstrate that he could use 4 cranes at the same time. So the speed at which you can build a super tall like that is directly proportional to how many cranes you can have active at the same time. They showed they could get 4 working where everybody else could do 3 or 2, and they won this project. So the project is 632 meters tall. It has a program in it, including an observation tower. It will be actually have the highest occupiable platform in the world. So this occupational level here is taller than what is in the Burj Khalifa. But it's mixed in with apartments, hotels, office building, retail. It's a real mixed-use project. The basic design idea of it was built around the idea of the flow of the Huangpu River as it comes around the Pudong Peninsula. Shanghai Tower is built around these geometries. So it's a fairly simple kind of triangular shape that then twists as it goes up towards the top of the building. But we looked at design studies after this was kind of settled on about exactly how much twist should we use, how much taper should we have. All of this was done in tools like Rhino and Maya. And you're starting to hear a lot of different pieces of software here. And what happens is that the most cutting edge work that's being done in Grasshopper these days is not about a great design tool, it's about translation tools. So you can get data from one piece of software into another piece of software and not lose the intelligence of it. So trying to be able to take the structural data that we get, dump it into Tekla to do the detailing and bring it back into our Revit model so that we can do coordination. We build on that, and the design is actually influenced, all of those decisions are really influenced by both computer modeling of wind as well as physical modeling of the wind. So this is about a 6-foot tall model that's dropped into a wind tunnel. And once you kind of get settled on what both the aesthetics and the performance variables are on that, then you build a really, really big model of that, and you put it into a tunnel like that. And what you can see is at the bottom here, the thing that's highlighted in the corner is the performance of this building in the wind. And it's not the most efficient performing shape. The most efficient was even more twists on this building to reduce the drag. And if you've done a super tall, most of your structure is not about carrying gravity load, it's all about resisting the wind, making sure it doesn't fall over. So we use those same results to look at how much the pressure is on both in positive and negative. The left side is positive pressure on the building, and there's a much greater negative pressure on the building here. So being able to use that data and pump it back into how we approach the design is really important, to do it on the fly, not have to just design it all, test it, and just see if it works, because that usually ends up in over-designing the project at that time. We take it all the way down to the level of the detailing of the curtain wall. And so we designed it no less than 6 completely different ways to clad this building, testing through mock-ups as well as building it all in, this is all done in an Autodesk Inventor, and this is not just us. We're working very closely with the different curtain wall manufacturers to get to this point. But those basic shapes are all actually plugged into another Grasshopper script. So the entire skin of this building was done in the Grasshopper script, so that all the same tapers and twists and the details of how that facade was put together in this script here, which is the largest we've seen so far. So Michael Peng in our Shanghai office put this together. And again, this is now with the idea that we want to be able to go back and do this and have it documented so that multiple people can use this at the same time and work more like a Microsoft in how we approach splitting up tasks and documenting and being able to communicate with each other is really important for moving forward. The last piece on this, on the Shanghai Tower, is a couple of things that are just happening out in the public. Now, obviously, we take photographs of our buildings as they go up, but this building is so prominent that we actually, some of the best photography on this is actually coming from websites. So Skyscraper City has over 670 pages of images posted to it and discussion about the project, and just photos taken every single day. The image on the left is a Google Earth image, and that model that you see there, which was obviously done in SketchUp and dropped into Google Earth, was done by a teenager who just liked the building. And so every Friday he would update that model for us without any of our knowledge, just based upon what he saw. And so our Shanghai office actually tracked him down, and he's now an intern in our office. The last thing I'm going to show here is just a few more images of other projects we've done using digital technology that are a little bit more cutting edge and where we think we're headed towards now. That's CA, by the way, for the Broad Museum down the street. So he's got a screen that's about that wide, and he has shop drawings, and he has digital project, and he has Illustrator up to be able to do all the CA work on a project that's having its curtain wall designed after it would started construction. So that is, that's it for me. I'm going to leave some pieces here of other projects that we're doing globally around the world. There we go.
Well, I don't know actually what to say after all that, but anyway, I'm going to try and bring this home to sort of a smaller scale, and being that our new home is downtown, we're very happy to be here. I really want to kind of talk about design culture. We believe that a culture is actually built from the bottom up with support from the top, and that's how we work and how we've sort of grown that culture here in our Los Angeles office. And as part of that, we thought it was actually very important several years ago to articulate for ourselves actually how we work in terms of how we approach projects and how we actually design them. And I think our first diagram that we kind of drew to ourselves was really kind of what we're not, which is what's up here. As you can imagine, for a large firm, it's very important for processes to be scalable, since we actually occupy many different scales of sizes of offices. And this is one, maybe at the risk of oversimplification, we call sort of a more of an aesthetic-driven design process, one that's basically sort of harbored within the subjectivity of the design leader, and the design team members actually contribute to that process through the design leader. But we find this actually be kind of limiting, because there's only so much information you kind of throughput you can actually put through the design leader before he or she cannot actually take on that capacity. And in terms of how the client gets involved, it becomes much more of sort of presenting to the client a very viewer-viewed situation. And if the subjectivity of the design agenda of that design leader doesn't match up with the client, then that design space gets very thin. We prefer and have sort of evolved into this model where we look at the design leader as being more of the sort of the steward of the design. He sort of shepherds it through the process. The idea is really what drives the design. That's something that everybody in the project can contribute to. What you get is a slightly more inclusive process that sort of spurns collaboration and makes the project space rather large through each person's sort of contribution and, shall we say, thumbprint on it. And I think ultimately what we believe is that this actually becomes a situation where everybody feels like they own the project. And if everybody owns the project, we believe the work will be better. And thus, we also thought it was important to sort of document that process and be able to tell our design stories and show how this process actually produces sort of design narratives visually. It started off much more as a sort of an internal thing where we would share it amongst ourselves in the office, but also with other offices within sort of Gensler's global network. These are some images from ideas 1 and 2 and 3. And as it evolved, it became much more of an external tool that we would use to actually explain our design stories and our processes to our clients, so our clients could also start to buy into this process as well. It's like if you know the rules of the game, you can contribute, and this was our way of being able to communicate that. In Ideas 4, the editorial staff, which is, I should note, is made up totally of volunteers, who every year decide they want to contribute and be part of this process, thought that it was important in our design stories to start taking images from real life that could speak to the ideas that were driving some of our work. And so with Ideas 5, which is going to be released very soon, we actually took a step back and said, you know, we've been spending 4 years sort of documenting projects, but we wanted to take hold of a lot of the digital processes and sort of celebrate that, the stuff that Eric was talking about, and some of the applied research that Shawn will be talking about. And thus, we observed that a lot of projects had pieces of them that were sort of being investigated and sort of examined by certain team members that deserved sort of notice and sharing amongst the office. So the lower half of this slide is actually the table of contents where we observed that many materials were being investigated, they were to serve certain functions, and that there were certain formal operations that were being applied to those materials to serve those functions that ultimately produced experiential effects, which I think as architects, that's one of our main charges and responsibilities for doing, is that we are asked to do that. And so these are just some previews from that. This is a metal mesh that was being done for a theater in India that sort of changes its malleability and transforms its sort of transparent properties to both serve visual purposes as well as acoustic. This is a tilt-up building in San Diego recently completed, done out of concrete, and how the exploration of pattern could start to lend guidance to the variety of window placement. This was an investigation on fabric, both opaque and transparent fabric that would enshroud these meeting rooms on an interiors project, the pattern sort of growing out of an ability and desire to support the company's brand. This project that I'm going to talk about, the LAPD Memorial to Fallen Officers, was really an opportunity for us to actually test this collaborative process at the scale of our office. How scalable was this process? And so we tested it on ourselves when this opportunity came up. When the LAPD Foundation came to us, which is an organization, nonprofit, that actually helps to support the LAPD with funding and procurement of materials that they need, they basically came to us with 2 pieces of information. One was that the site was to be in part of an open space to the east of the new headquarters building. The other was that the form and shape of this could not actually act to serve harbor or protect people who were threats to the actual headquarters building. So those are the 2 pieces of information that we were provided with, and we felt like, well, we needed to elicit sort of their response or their feelings about what a memorial was. Was it for the LAPD? Was it for the families of the fallen officers? To get some specificity to this. So in order to do that, we actually created a call for ideas throughout the whole LA office to come and share with us sketches and ideas about what a memorial was, and maybe even more specifically, what a memorial for the LAPD would be. So these were all pinned up on a Wednesday night design review. It's something we do every week where we pull a project off the boards so that we can share it with the rest of the office, get discourse about it, and we believe that process makes our work better. 30 ideas were proposed. They were then organized into 4 sort of groupings based on compositional sort of pursuits: a memorial as space, a memorial as object, a memorial as sort of a linear organization, and a memorial as sort of a field organization. Each one of these groups was made up of volunteer team members who wanted to participate and pursue the idea of a memorial along those lines, and were headed up by a design director, and the sizes varied. One design director, Richard Hammond, had 16 people he had to corral in sort of a line to produce an idea. I only got 2, so you can kind of tell how popular I was. 2 other design directors, David Herjecki and Philippe Paré, got about 5 or 6. So, and these ideas were then presented back to the LAPD and the foundation, not in the context of, these are ideas that we have, we're not asking you to pick one. These are 4 different approaches, and to actually elicit their response and their feelings and reactions, so we could actually go about creating a design program for this. And that conversation proved very fruitful. A few things came out of it. One, they agreed that the site to the east, the open space, was actually too small, and so they expanded to allow us to put it anywhere within that open space. 2, they really felt it was important for this memorial to sort of speak to what the LAPD does, which is to protect and to serve. And 3, they felt like the material of the badge was very important to include that somehow in the memorial. And for those of you who don't know, a badge is given out to each graduate of the academy, and it's seen as their most precious item as a source of pride for what they do. So as a result of the space getting larger, it actually encompassed now 2 spaces that actually were designed with 2 different purposes. One was the Memorial Plaza, which is where the LAPD has sort of formal ceremonies and activities. The other half was a community garden that was basically a community give back. It was designed much more casually to sort of encourage the community to sort of partake and share in the space of the headquarters. We actually decided to place a threshold, basically to mark a threshold between those 2 spaces. And it was important that that threshold could both communicate the idea of protection, that is, between, shall we say, the public and the LAPD, and then those threats, to the public, but also serve as a mediator between those 2, because that's the service part, is in terms of the LAPD mediating between the people and the bodies of governance that oversee that. So we looked at doing it as a wall, something very simple. Budget at one point comes into this equation. And so we examined the evolution of the memorial as a wall type. We also examined the evolution of sort of the tectonics of how walls are put together, and decided that the material of this memorial would be brass, to speak directly to the material of the badge, and that each fallen officer would have a plate with their name water jet cut into the plate, and that this wall would be formed by amalgamation of these plates. That from far away could actually perhaps be perceived as being more solid, but as one gets close, you begin to be able to see the space that lies in between them. Oops. And so this was an early sort of study model of that. Each plate was sort of phenomenologically held up in light to give it each name sort of an individual scale of honor. We also knew this material would patina and sort of mark the passage of time, which we thought was appropriate given the role of this piece. And so this was the final rendering we actually showed to LAPD and Chief Bratton, who was the chief at the time, to gain their approval for this. And this project, which is probably about 3 or 4 years old, was really one of our first explorations on a small scale to file the fabrication. We like to do small projects because it gives us the opportunity to sort of test some of these ideas that we can actually apply to our larger ones. And so, of course, each layer of this memorial was sort of color-coded, sent off to Zahner, who we were very fortunate to be able to have as the fabricator of this piece, and assembled as one piece, then taken to put on a crate and then shipped over. I think one of the things that we really enjoy about telling about this story is that I think it speaks to the ownership part of the initial diagram that I showed. That if everybody owns it, it's not just the people who work on it in our office, and it's our consultants, it's our clients, and our fabricators. And this was a story that, in terms of the design process and the idea, that we communicated with Zahner many times. They were very proud to be a part of it. It's kind of shown by this commemorative photograph before they created this up and sent it on an 18-wheeler over to LA. The Kansas City Police, where Zahner is located, actually got wind that this memorial was being done in their hometown, so they decided to escort it to the Kansas City County line, whereupon it embarked westward, picked up at the LA County line by the LAPD, and escorted onto site, uncrated, and then lifted into place. Clearly, there's a very strong lore to the LAPD, and I don't think it would be wrong to say that at times it's been controversial in terms of their role within LA's history. We did talk about this in the office at times because I think it comes down to values, and we recognize that what we do promotes certain values. But what was really interesting, I think, for all of us was that as we got into this, we kind of really, all that sort of concern went away. And it was really about the people who had sacrificed their lives who were being honored by this. This next project, the last one I'm going to talk about, Network LA Transit, is actually special within this context because it wouldn't have happened without SCI-Arc. SCI-Arc, several years ago, SCI-Arc and the LA Metro and the Architects newspaper actually sponsored a competition as a call for ideas on how to best spend Proposition R money, which had just passed, to earmark $40 billion for public transportation. When I saw this brief, I went to Rob and I said, we got to do this. I need $50,000 to field a team to do this. And obviously, it was really nice to hear that he agreed. So thank you, Rob. And it kind of gave us an opportunity to sort of get into sort of speculative projects, which had not necessarily been always a tradition in our office, and be able to sort of try and get ahead of our clients and get ahead of where things are. That team that came together actually had never worked on a transit project before, myself included. So we were sort of approaching this a little bit from a naive standpoint. But we did recognize that the condition we were facing was a little bit like this quote by Dante, which is that hell is a place where nothing connects with nothing, and that sometimes is what the public transit system sort of feels like to us. Obviously, complex questions bring up complex solutions, and I won't go through all of this. It's just one of the two boards with a menu of different solutions for different scales of issues. But I will go through some of just the key questions we asked. One is, do we focus on the rail or do we focus on ground transport? And so we actually did this diagram that sort of matched up where the present and future lines in the metro and where the population quantity was in the West Side Corridor, which was the area that we were asked to sort of examine by the brief. And we realized that the metro is going to where most of the people are. This is a good thing. We also thought it was important to explain why ground transport was actually much more efficient, not just more sustainable, but more efficient, which is a sustainability in another way. So this top line here basically represents 5 60-seater buses that carry 300 people going 30 miles an hour. That's the space it takes to do that. This represents 254 cars at 1.18 people per car, which is the average occupancy of a car in Los Angeles to take 300 people going at 30 miles an hour, plus the space to park those cars, and that's only in one location because that would be, let's say, at work. There'd also be an equal amount of space devoted to the domestic, but we thought this kind of got the point across. And it kind of emboldened us to really try and look at this differently. Another challenge that we thought we faced was how do you actually start to remove or ameliorate the stigmatization of public transit in Los Angeles? I think Los Angeles is one of the few places where public transit is seen as being sort of almost an indication of class. And could you actually empower it without taking away the sort of individual kind of spirit that I think is very much a part of Los Angeles culture and has been part of its inventiveness over the generations? Could you find a way to get around without having to look at this map? Anybody who's seen the LA Metro map could probably, it's very comprehensive, but it's positively like labyrinthic, if not completely Byzantine in terms of trying to figure out where to go to get anywhere. Could you find a way to make the system more efficient in the sense of filling more buses instead of just adding more vehicles to the fleet, which is the typical response? And the answer was perhaps naively simple, which is that you just put the buses where the demand is. And how could you do that? So then if you could do that, could you actually create a system that organically adapts to sort of user demands in real time so that the centers of gravity of demand, as they shift, the fleet could actually adjust to that. So for example, instead of having 10 buses with 2 people in one area of Los Angeles, you could have 2 with like 30 people, thus liberating the other 8 to sort of be dispatched to other areas of the city where the demand was higher.
So that added some sound to the mix tonight. My name is Shawn Gehle. I'm a design director at Gensler Los Angeles as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the application of research in the office and how we're approaching this sort of pioneering and materials research that we're embarking on currently. The first project I want to start with is the communal table that's inside of our lobby. We refer to it as a SLOGEN table. It was an academic partnership between Gensler Los Angeles and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. We had 3 students earmarked for a project that would be focused on 2 different things. One is material innovation, and the second would be a virtual or digital focused design studio where they would be in Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, and we in Los Angeles would be able to do design reviews and critiques as we went through the process. This was myself and 2 other designers in our office, Richard Hammond and Sabu Song, and then Corey Walker and Keegan and Ben. They were hand-selected, and each came up with their own different design for a program that included a furniture piece in our lobby that could hold propaganda, all the literature that we hand out, the ideas books, the dialogue that firm-wide puts out, as well as be a communal piece that people that were visiting our office could come and sit at. 3 different ideas were converged into a single idea, and that piece was then moved through another 10-week session of refinement, ultimately going through a completely digital-centric process. It did include prototyping, but that was done through our ABS plastics modeler. Everything was completely modeled in Rhino, and each one of the pieces here were used for fabrication, and we worked with RD Wing in Seattle. The idea was that the piece would be fabricated, the base, the egg crate would be fabricated out of birch plywood. This is something that we're using a lot in the office just in terms of our own space in Los Angeles. And then the top would be made out of solid surfacing material, much like this, but a little bit more formed than this. And it would be 3 basic pieces. The top, which would be a horizontal piece, simply cut on a CNC. And then the 2 side pieces, which were tapered in underside each of the walls, which required a little bit more gymnastics to pull off. The egg crating is pretty straightforward. It was built in 2 different halves, pushed together, held together upside down as the same forming exercise was going on for the solid surfacing. The egg crate was pushed together. The beam that runs down through the middle was added. A seam strap was added as well, and this was a great collaboration that we had with Burrow Hackable and Greg Otto, who we've been really fortunate to do some work with, and this was a great experience for us, as well as the engineer who was assigned to this project, which was also a Cal Poly grad. There is a pre-camber, I will point out, that allows this thing to be pulled up about 2 inches out of horizontal before any of the solid surfacing was added, which you begin to see here, which was all pretty straightforward. The next thing is the forming of the side panels, and this was done in 2 different ways. One is a pretty simple drape form, which is just high-density foam that's milled out on the CNC machine. The pieces are individually laid onto the forms and then heated up so that they drape into place. We worked really closely with LG Houses, who was the donator of all the solid surfacing for this project. They were a great partner, and they gave us access to their material scientists and their engineers to really understand what the limits of the material were. And that allowed us to look at things like clam molds, which you see over here, which are 2 separate pieces. A piece of solid surface is then put in between, and under heat and under pressure is able to be formed into a more aggressive shape, which you see here after one of the clam pieces is pulled off. These are individually formed based on the size of each one of the sheet panels that we have. They're then pulled together and thermally welded, held in place after that weld is achieved, and then built up individually as even larger pieces side by side, clamped, welded, and then this will be buffed out, which is what you see on the right-hand side. The entire table, which is about 16 feet long, was crated into one box, put on the back of a 18-wheeler, and shipped from Seattle to Los Angeles. It arrived about 5 months after this process, and I'll point out, and to Rob's credit again, not to be the second person to sort of compliment Rob in this thing, is that we taught the studio on our own time from the office's standpoint, and when we pitched the idea with the prototype and with the model that we had in the drawings, it was really an opportunity for us, much like SCI-Arc, to have these series of artifacts begin to emerge in our office about material investigation at a totally different level. pioneer these on small projects and then scale them up, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So you can see it located in our lobby there on the ground floor. And the cantilever, which is roughly about a 40% cantilever. This was the part that was ultimately pre-cambered up about 2 inches before the solid surfacing was put on. It appears monolithic. It's been completely thermally welded and then buffed as a solid piece. The back here is where it holds all of our literature and all the material that we hand out. It also has the prototype model. If you're ever in our office, you can look at the small little replica of it. And the detailing, which you can see where the beam goes down the center. This was a great project, not only for us in terms of our experience from a material standpoint, but to be able to partner with an academic institution. We'd love to do more of these, and we're certainly looking for those opportunities whenever they emerge. The second one is a project that we're doing at Santa Monica College, and specifically I want to talk about the wall piece that's over here on the right. This is a project that has a long lineage in the office, and at least in the studio that I'm working in that it continues the exploration of a particular material and process, much like what Lee was describing in the Ideas 5 book. We had a really simple idea, which was to take sheet goods, put a dough roller on it, and put cutters on it and perforate metal. It's a really simple idea. The notion was to have zero waste, but to be able to play with that perforation in a really economic way, and to put colored waterproofing behind it, which is where this started a few projects ago. And like anything, it begins to evolve and develop. This particular project didn't go forward, and so when we began to look at SMC, we started to look at some of the same ideas. Surprisingly enough, as we really got into this and really started to explore inside the studio, we were trying to figure out, where the limitations were of being able to make this kind of perfing and tabbing thing reach its maximum, and in the spirit of playing fail in a way. And we ended up with a pattern like this for SMC initially. The notion was, again, perfing and tabbing, metal panel. We went to price it. It came out too expensive. We had really significant budget constraints. We thought that we were going to be able to do it with this, and so we started looking at even lighter materials. And so one of the materials that we looked at was FRP, and what it afforded us was the opportunity to also look at perfing in a different way. The perfing was, in the previous projects, were all uniform from top to bottom. And by introducing FRP, it allowed us to do two things. One is that we could form the surface, which is not something we could do out of the original kind of aluminum powder-coated idea. And the other one was play with the perforations. So we moved away from an idea of the dough roller and something that was more about forming things that we were seeing and sort of playing with in that first table project that we just showed. And what we ended up with is an FRP panel that's amazingly economic because of the way that it's conceived. It's based on a 15 by 30 inch panel that's milled out, formed, and then repeated all the way up. That's the most cost effective way to make that topography in terms of repeating the piece. But it also focuses all the dollars that are really less expensive dollars and the easiest things to do, which is the water jet cutting, on something that can be completely and totally unique as you go up the building. So what we ended up doing is writing a script. This is a simple script in comparison to some of the stuff that Eric's been showing, for us to be able to manipulate that perforation pattern based on the original Xing to something that had a much more rounded shape and that we could taper as it went from top to bottom. And you can just see how this is built. So you see the 15 by 30 inch panel. These are now being looked at as 5 by 5 panels. Each one of the 5 by 5 panels from a FRP standpoint are the exact same. It's only the perforation that's unique. And then they are mirrored at the very top as they go up the building. Another big part of the way that we're working is around prototyping, and we have an ABS plastics model printer in our office, as well as laser cutters and an amazing wood shop. This is one of the prototypes that came out of this. So this is about 8 inches tall. It has 5 unique panels, and then in addition to that, the soffit panel, which is also developed here. This allowed us to convey to the client the detailing, the idea of the perforation, also the notion that we were going to be using colored Sarnafeld roofing as the predominant waterproofing along the wall. And then we took the Rhino model from that and immediately stuffed it into Revit. This is one of the things that we're doing, which is really mating a lot of software. Eric talked about this before, but this is a really straightforward approach in terms of getting the material immediately into our documents. This goes into construction documents, and these are the construction documents for this project. It also allows us to catalog and to be able to systematize the way that we convey this information, as well as communicate this to contractors. We moved that out and into the land of fabrication, working again with RD Wing. So now we're looking at a 30 by 30 inch one-to-one mock-up that's in our office. This is actual FRP that's been water jet cut. And you see the sort of edge detailing that you get out of the water jet. The next thing I want to talk about is the glass that's adjacent to these panels. The issue with this project in terms of the screen was that in this particular portion of the program, there's a dance studio in this portion, and directly across from it is a parking structure, and they had concerns that there would be people standing in the parking structure watching people dance. I can't imagine why. And so we developed a frit pattern that would be based on the X. We used the original script, which was about the perforation, to develop a pretty straightforward kind of proximity idea. This looks simple and compared to some of the stuff from Farmers Field and certainly Shanghai. But it's an amazingly powerful script in that what it does is it looks at the proximity of the X, and then it deals with scaling. As the X's get closer together, they converge, they're unioned, making this transitional pattern. That's then mirrored, flipped on top of itself, and then scaled up the building vertically. This is all controllable, so what it allows us to do is now, after we have this in place, is to generate a series of, these are ultimately graphic prints that are done. These are one-to-one scale prints. We're able to tune this back and forth to the point where we get to something that we're happy with, that we're ready to prototype. And then what we do is we move into what is the laser cutter rastering process. So these are all plexiglass pieces that have been rasterized. This is also recently featured in some of the stuff that was released by McNeil and Rhino. We put these not only in our office or around the studio, but also on the exterior part of the office. The plaza that's directly adjacent to us, we're able to see from a distance. So you not only get shadow, but you're also able to see it from like 2 stories below. The last thing I want to talk about is a competition proposal that we just submitted and won. Recently, we were just in DC sharing this, and it was a call for the office building of the future, which was really interesting given the history that Rob pointed out in the firm around corporate office and interiors. This originally started off as, to be honest, an academic studio that Lee and I had taught earlier this year in January with Cal Poly students again, looking at the evolution of the office building. And the notion here was that we're embarking on a very different time for the single-purpose office building, and that we need to sort of change the paradigm of thinking about how we look at those buildings moving forward. So this term was coined, this hackable building idea, the notion that we would be moving away from single-purpose office buildings into something very different. And that to really understand how we would move forward with this, we need to look at some historic context. So we looked at 12 buildings from 3 different eras in downtown Los Angeles. We looked at the pre-war buildings. These are the classic letter-form buildings, narrow footplates, narrow floor plates, buildings that are optimized for natural ventilation and natural daylighting. You have the buildings between World War II and the 1970s, where you begin to see mechanical ventilation and vertical transportation show up. And then the sort of height of speculative office buildings, which emerged in the 1990s, where massive amounts of repetition and verticality start to show up. Each of these was compared for their individual floor plate square footages, their total building square footage, and then also the influence, which was very clear that the elevator was beginning to drive buildings to be taller and taller. The most important thing that came out of this was ultimately this. It's the conversion chart about the older buildings changing the use from office to something else. And as I pointed out earlier, these earlier buildings were fairly small, both from a floor plate standpoint and also from a total square footage point of view, which allowed them to be fairly easily converted to another single purpose. But what was probably the most fascinating was that this thing was beginning to taper down, meaning that these were fairly young buildings by, the early kind of continental building standards. And so the question that we were sort of posing for this competition was, were newer office buildings really necessary for the future of work? And if not, what was going to be happening to these larger, buildings that you begin to see built in the 1990s? Especially when you given the building stock, which is very mature in North America compared to Asia. The requests that had come to us for the Office Building of the Future competition really laid out and really speculated that this would be a new building. And that was fundamentally in question for us almost from the beginning, not only from the research that we were doing. The requests had come in March and we had started our studio in January. But when you look at the comparison of both supply and demand, why are we building new buildings, which sounds so bizarre to come from an architect. It comes around three basic qualities of where the future of work is going and what it's going to be influenced by. First is mobility, because as we all know, everything that's on our desk is now completely and totally mobile. It's changing the paradigm of where work is being done. We've put everybody into motion, and companies in almost every company is kind of leveraging this to some level. It forces us to rethink many of the paradigms that have been in place over the last 3 decades and many of the sort of conventions and governing factors. And it's being leveraged at almost every level, but it's beginning to be speculated by multiple people. We have talked to not only experts here. I know Carl Molstein, who I saw earlier, was a key person that we had met with early on, as well as other folks from Jones Lang LaSalle. And it doesn't mean that companies are getting smaller. It just means that they're leveraging mobility in a completely different way. And we were really wanting to focus on, so what happens to all this, red space? What happens to the single-purpose office building when you have this happening across cities? Because from a sustainability standpoint, isn't reuse the most sustainable thing you could do? And looking inside of a paradigm that's around mobility, why are we building new buildings which fundamentally are about kind of a churn and a positivity about moving people through rather than housing them? And the third part is speed to market, which is how quickly could the market evolve beyond the traditional thinking that they were looking at, which is always build new. There's always a newer, better paradigm, and develop something that's much more incremental. So we came up with this idea of small pioneering interventions that could be done incrementally, beginning to generate revenue individually versus the time that it would take to raise capital, drop a building down, and then build a new one in place. These interventions could be fairly small and fairly straightforward in terms of just simple changes of use. They could also begin to add things that begin to change the landscape and kind of the attractors that are put into buildings, totally changing the idea of what a corporate office is to something that's much more lifestyle and culturally oriented. And then the next round would be things that are become much more system-oriented, sort of evolving and upgrading a system that is continually devolving, especially for the buildings that have been in place for 2, 3, 4 decades. We're clear that there's obviously a level of cost and an effort of implementation that make these sort of gradually more aggressive, maybe to the point of adding a transit stop below something. But we applied this idea to 2 different projects, one in LA and one in DC. The first one is the J. Edgar Hoover building, and for those of you who don't know, this is the FBI. I've said many times, what a better building to hack, although I'm probably end up on a watch list for that. It's right along Pennsylvania Avenue and the National Mall. The Hoover building is a kind of classic 1970s DC perimeter block building, huge building, 2 million square feet. What a lot of people don't know is that there's this courtyard inside of it and that there are some of the most secure functions inside of this existing block that sits on top. Our idea was to start to remove some of that program, kind of thin it out in a really healthy way, making a connection along Pennsylvania Avenue, beginning to add program in a very different way, including repurposing that upper block for not only a soccer field on the top, but also retail, which would drive users up and through the building, and then to provide access along the rooftop, which would give you a completely different view of DC, which is not afforded to most people. This was one of the images that was submitted. It shows the sort of ground level retail and the change of a hotel along one side, as well as sort of some of the imagery for the uppermost levels, in addition to those uppermost rooftop gardens in the soccer field, which got quite a few comments when we were suggesting this. I will point out that we were one of 4 winners in very different ways, but we were the only the only team, I should say, that suggested doing something with an existing building as opposed to a new building. The second building was the Union Bank building here in Los Angeles. For those, I'm sure everyone knows, it's one of the first buildings in the Bunker Hill development. The idea here is actually really straightforward. It's really a sectional play. It's beginning to deal with program in a very different way, putting ground floor or lower level uses that have very high occupancy and egress requirements in place, and then sectionally splicing the building so that you have things like education, health and wellness, hotels, something like a data center to splice in and to take up, low occupancy, low rent areas, but have a very positive output byproduct, which is hot water, which could then drive residential hot water uses, as well as potentially like a spa. All of these would then play sort of an amenity role to what would be office space that was traditional, but also something that could begin to sort of carve into the building in a very different way and create volume like we don't traditionally have in kind of the standard 13.5-foot floor to plate. 13.5-foot floor-to-floor floor plates of the tall office building. The other idea is that these things begin to manifest themselves on the outside of the building, so you're no longer looking at repetitive skins, but instead you're looking at graphic elements that begin to emerge, start showing and conveying what their program changes are. So here you have the health club, you have residential, multiple floors of an office that then has a connective sort of element that graphically brands themselves. The notion is that once you did this in the one building and sort of set a precedent from a cultural standpoint, you'd begin to see this sort of permeate through the city, so that as one building did it, you'd have multiple that went through the city. The last piece I want to show is a video of our own office, which quite honestly is probably one of the first buildable, hackable projects that we've done. And it gives you a little bit of history on our office. I'm going to spare the last bit of credits there. We're going to show one last thing and then open it up to questions. This last video was actually done in our previous office, and I think it's a testament to the type of space that we were in. I think our own interest in sort of hacking that space, but also the culture of what we call sort of the culture of curiosity that we want to find in any space that we're in, regardless of if it was office space like what you're going to see or what you just saw in our most recent office. But most importantly, that comes out of the individuals that come and join our office and work and labor over all the work that you've seen here today, because what we've shown is really not the work of the 4 people here, but a lot of different people in our office. So thanks for having us. I'm going to play this, again, some more music, and then we'll take some questions.
listen, I want to thank everybody. I think we've probably run a little long. If nothing else, we're having fun. We can, if you want, take a couple quick questions, but we do realize that we ran long. Go right ahead, Bill.
I was really interested in the involvement with the students, but I was quite surprised that I didn't hear there were SCI-Arc students, considering the neighbors that we are and the fact that Peter listed these 10 really good points about how compatible we are. How did that happen?
Take it away.
Well, I'll say we'd love to do this with SCI-Arc. I mean, I think this was part of the reason of coming here today. Cal Poly's program is a really unique one in that it's a professional co-op studio, which means that we have students that come and actually are in our office. So that's a unique opportunity. But at the same time, we're fortunate that we have staff on hand that are also teaching here. We'd love to do a materials studio. I think it'd be a fantastic opportunity to, one, bring what we bring to the table, which is great manufacturing and engineering connections and the subcontracting community, to do much of what you guys see here. I mean, we'd love to do that. So let's figure out a way.
I think it'd be a great way to enhance the construction technology program here in this school as well. And considering that you have 36 SCI-Arc alumni that are working for you, there's already the connection made, and I think it could just get better.
Agreed.
Thank you.
And we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nothing else?
Very much.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.